start this afternoon with the second keynote speak. I'm Pamina Koenig, by the way, from Paris School of Economics. And so we're going to listen to a talk by Professor Myrto Kalouptsidi from Harvard University. So we're very happy to have Myrto with us today, not only because she's a renowned economist specialized in industrial organization, but also because she knows a lot about shipping, maritime economics. And the floor is yours. For the micro. Thanks.
Okay, is this good? Yes. Okay, thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here, and I'm excited to talk about this research, especially in such a diverse audience. So I'm going to talk about transportation infrastructure and trade disruptions. Okay, so let me start with the very last one, trade disruptions. And I'm going to start by saying that, as you all already know, in recent years, it has certainly felt like we've gotten a lot of disruptions in trade that seem to be one way or another related to transportation. So I would argue it started in the aftermath of COVID, and I'll come back to this in a second. But then there's been just a barrage of headlines from the Houthi attacks to the Panama Canal droughts to the Suez Canal being blocked by a huge container ship, and right now to the Strait of Hormuz concerns. Okay. So if I were to pick one of them, just to zoom in, I would pick the aftermath of COVID, where for me as a research economist studying these things, it was very exciting because we went from a world where this sector was sort of invisible to economists and the general public. But after articles such as this one, which made a lot of splash, it really made the news every single day. Okay. So shipping and ports in particular were really at the epicenter of the great supply chain disruptions after COVID. And a policy debate, I don't want to say began, it sort of continued, and billions were planned to be spent to improve efficiency and resilience of our infrastructure. Okay. At the same time, in the aftermath of COVID, it so happened that sort of an important problem was inflation and increases in prices. I'm going to focus on commodity prices, but as you know, manufactured goods are the same. There were goods shortages. And what happened was there was a lot of speculation about what was the role of transportation to these increases in prices. And so a lot of policymakers and the press and prominent economists started asking to what extent these problems in ports and in transportation and infrastructure were to be blamed for the increase in prices that we've seen since COVID. Okay. And so I'm about to jump into what we are doing in our research. But I want to start with a comment that to those of you that know shipping is going to be trivial, but to those that don't, usually comes as a surprise, which is that despite the fact that this sector has really made the news recently, and a lot of people are talking about transportation infrastructure and disruptions, in fact, these are not unique phenomena that the sector has never seen before, okay? So what I'm plotting here is a graph that anyone in shipping knows exactly what it is, but to others, it comes as a surprise. I'm plotting just shipping rates, freight rates, for bulk ships, container ships, and tankers. Okay, and I want to show you two things in these graphs. The first one is they're extremely volatile. They're much more volatile than any stock market. The second is that you can see the COVID disruptions in all of them in the 2020s, but in some segments, actually, recent disruptions were even bigger, okay? So that is to say, a lot of these disruptions that we're talking about now, I'm not going to argue they're not extreme, they are, and maybe we are indeed moving to a more volatile world. We've had a lot of discussion about that today. But at the same time, this is not something this sector has never seen or heard of before. So with all that in mind, our research kind of starts from the premise that transportation infrastructure is crucial for trade and growth, to state the obvious. And the questions I'm going to try and answer today are, first, what are the costs of these transportation disruptions? Second, what are the returns from investing in infrastructure, in particular in ports? So what are the benefits that we get from such investment? And third, what is the link between transportation markets and rising commodity prices as one prominent macroeconomic outcome we are interested in? Okay, and the research is really based on both rich data that I'm going to talk about in a second, as well as quantitative modeling that I'm not going to talk about, but I'm going to give some intuition about what we do. And it's based on a series of papers with some longtime co-authors, and some of it goes all the way back 10 years ago to what was my PhD. Okay, so I will talk about the data that we have. Then I will spend a little bit of time talking about what is port congestion and what it means for trade. Then I'm going to talk about investing in port infrastructure, and then I'm going to end with our newer stuff, which is transportation and macro outcomes. Okay. Okay. So let me tell you quickly okay, this is not my newer set of slides, but that's okay. So let me tell you quickly the data that we actually work with. So what we've done is we've collected a series of different data sets that have to do with maritime transportation and ports in particular. For everything I'm going to talk about today, in terms of data, is going to be on bulk shipping. So these are ships that carry raw materials like iron ore, coal, bauxite, grain, stuff like that. But for the economics I'm going to talk about, I think almost everything is going to carry through to containers. Quantitatively, you might get different things, and I will stress some differences. We're now doing the same work for containers. So the main data set we're going to use is essentially vessel positions. So think of these like timestamps that say, here's a port, here's a ship, it entered this port, it stayed for this long, it unloaded, and then it left. But we're going to combine, and so I have a picture. This is the port of Shanghai during COVID, so that you see the ports, the ships waiting around. We're going to complement this with some information on the charges that ports, the prices that ports are charging, employment, for ports. And then the other main piece of information that we collect ourselves is information on port infrastructure. So we manually go to Google Earth at each port, and we collect things like what are the length of the berths that each port has, what are the storage areas, what are the how many cranes are available to pick up cargo. Okay. And we did this work partly because a lot of the information that is out there is not as accurate for several reasons. For example, a lot of the public data sets are going to say things like, this port has 5 berths, but a berth can be really small or really, really long. And so you can have a port with 5 berths that is much, much smaller than, a port with a huge berth, even if it has a single one. Okay, so let me jump straight into port congestion, okay? So the key metric of port efficiency that we're going to think about is time at port, okay? So time at port is just how long ships are waiting when they visit a port. I'll come back to this in a second. It's to give you a sense of things, time at port is about half of the time that the ship spends to go from point A to point B. So it's a lot of time, okay? For the trade economists in the room, if we think about iceberg trade costs that say trade costs are a function of just distance, you're really missing a big component of costs, which actually happens at the nodes. And what I'm plotting here is probably a graph you expected to see, which is what happened to time at port in the last 10 years or so. And you can see that time at port tends to fluctuate quite a bit, actually. And you see the increase during COVID, where we saw a massive issue of port congestion.
This was in hours?
I think this is in days. This is in days. Mm-hmm.
So this is like at port, but if the port is congested, then the ship might wait outside the port.
Okay. This is total time at port. Okay. So what is time at port? You anticipated where I'm going. So what we want to ask now is, what is time at port? How is it formed? Okay, and this is going to be very important in understanding the nature of disruptions. Okay, so starting with something basic, time at port consists of two components. The first is service time. So this is the ship. Not the right slides. So this is the ship is parked. Okay, it is parked on a berth, and then workers and cranes come and they load or discharge the cargo. Okay, but if the ship arrives and the port is full, then the ship tends to wait outside the port in a designated area called an anchorage. Okay, so in that case, if there is a queue, the ship actually has to wait longer. Okay, so I'm going to spend a second to tell you what, just a couple of words about each of these components. So let's call the service time T. This is the amount of time the ship is going to actually spend getting serviced. And then the wait time is going to consist of two components. First, there has to be, it has to be that the port is full. When is the port going to be full? If the people who are ahead of me, which I'm going to call Q, are more than what the port can actually handle, which I'm going to call K. Okay? And if that's the case, then if Q is higher than this K, then I'm going to incur an additional wait time, which you can think of as congestion. You can ignore this stuff. This shouldn't have been there, actually. So there are these three variables that are really crucial in understanding time at port. So service time, capacity, and the ships that actually come at port, okay? So what is the service time? We think of the service time as a sort of production function for the port, okay? So you take workers, cranes, and the productivity of the port, and this tells you how quickly this port can service the vessels. And we actually estimate such a service time function by using observed service times in the data, because we know exactly how long ships are spending inside the port as a function of labor and cranes. K is the capacity of the port, which we think of as driven by infrastructure. So this depends on how many parking spots you have, so how much berth space, how much storage, so you can empty the vessels. And so we create a measure of effective capacity by actually looking at the satellite information and measuring what is the maximum number of ships that a port can handle at the same time. And we correlate this with infrastructure data. And finally, we have Q, which is the number of ships that actually choose to go to the port, which depends on basically the demand for the port, okay? So this is based on the decisions that ship owners make about which ports to actually visit, okay? And here we're gonna borrow insights from queuing theory as well as a demand model to figure out how ships arrive at different ports. I wanna say one thing about time at port, which is actually quite important, okay? This service time capacity and ship arrivals have a very important implication about congestion at port, which is crucial in understanding the nature of disruptions. And the thing that is crucial about time at port is that it is convex in demand. Okay, so let me explain what this graph is saying. So on the x-axis, we have the arrival of ships, okay? And here I'm showing total time at port in number of days. So what you see here is the following. When demand is really low, okay, I arrive at the port, I'm a ship, I arrive at the port is likely unconstrained because demand is very low. So I'm gonna go straight in, I'm gonna get service, and I'm gonna leave. And so when demand is low, total time at port is flat because it's just service time, okay? I don't have to wait outside the port. As demand increases, it becomes more and more likely that the port is constrained when I arrive. Okay, so I arrive at the port, now there is a higher chance, it's not just my service time, but also my wait time. And as I keep increasing demand, I'm gonna start overwhelming the system. And in the limit, time at port is going to have an explosive behavior. As demand keeps rising, the inflow is very big, the outflow is very small, and the system gets overwhelmed, okay? So an important implication of this is that actually small shocks, and in particular the accumulation of small shocks, can actually have a very big impact. Okay, so if a shock hits me here, it's fine because the system is unconstrained. If a small shock hits me here, it's going to push me into the convex part, and time at port is going to have an explosive behavior. So this is important, and it has important policy implications. If you think about the levers that we have for improving time at port, let's think about capacity or service times. So the purple line is what you saw before. The yellow line is a faster service time. So let's say we automate ports, for example, or productivity goes up in some other way. Time at port uniformly goes down. Every time I go, I'm going to have a faster service time. Everybody ahead of me is going to have a faster service time. Capacity is very different. So if I increase capacity of the port, which is the red line, in low demand, this is not going to matter much because the port was already unconstrained. But in high demand, this high capacity now acts as insurance. So it's like being in a supermarket, there is a queue, all of a sudden a new cashier comes up, the queue splits in half, and I wait way less time. So that's going to be important in a few minutes when I talk about investment in capacity. Okay, so let me jump into that. So what are the returns from investing in port infrastructure? Okay, so to do that, we need one piece that I'm only going to talk about in this one slide. So I showed you this port technology that determines how time at port is determined, but we also need a way to predict how many people will want to go to a specific port. So we're going to need a model for demand, okay? And we have a model of demand that really relies on the IO literature, where essentially we have importer-exporter pairs that want to go between point A and point B, and they have to choose which port to use in order to go from point A to B. And so they make this choice, and to make this choice, they basically look at congestion at different ports, and we're going to measure how much they care about that. But they're also going to care, of course, about the geography, so where are the different ports, the prices the ports have, the port quality, and other characteristics. And in this world, ports are substitutes, okay? So you can decide whether you want to use Rotterdam or Hamburg, okay? And people are going to make different choices, okay? So let me tell you what we get from this model. We actually get a few interesting and surprising findings. So the first question we can ask with it is how much importer-exporters actually care about time at port? How much do they value or disvalue rather congestion? And what we find is that users of ports are willing to pay about $45,000 to reduce time at port by 1 day, which is about 3 times higher than what in this time period, which is a bit older, would be the direct cost of renting out a ship for about $15,000. Okay, so it is much, much higher. And this, of course, captures all the disruptions that are gonna ripple through the supply chain if you actually get stuck at the port. Okay. The second question we can look at is substitutability across ports, and this is going to be important when we think about investment. Okay. So what this map shows is the percent of local substitution. So each dot is a port in the US, and I should have said for this project we focus on US ports, but a lot of this can be done also for globally. And so each dot is a port in the US, and what the map shows is the percent of substitution that is done locally if there is a small disruption at the port, so an increase in congestion. And what you see is that there is a lot of heterogeneity on this map, okay? So for example, in the Great Lakes, almost all of the substitution happens locally, okay? So there is a disruption in Duluth, Minnesota, almost everybody is gonna substitute to another port in the Great Lakes. This should come as no surprise. This happens because essentially this is trade between the Midwest of the US and Canada. Okay. However, In other areas, especially in the Gulf and the East Coast, substitution is actually highly non-local. Okay, so if you look at some ports in the Gulf, only 20% of substitution will be local following a disruption. And the reason for this is that, for example, if we compare Duluth, Minnesota to Baltimore, where only 13% of substitution is local, while Duluth executes this very local trade, Baltimore, in contrast, serves trade between very diverse and distant destinations. So, for example, it will serve trade between Europe and both the East Coast as well as the Midwest, which means that you might have the flexibility to substitute to a port that is much further away in order to avoid disruptions. This is the trade-off that this is looking at, okay? And so this matters because if you wanted to, our prior was actually to say, here is a port, you probably only substitute to the two closest ports, and we thought we'll restrict it at that, and that would have really gotten things very wrong. Okay. Okay, so now that we have this machinery, I can go to the first sort of real question we are after, which is, in this world of high volatility, what are the returns to investing in infrastructure? And if you have a given budget, like Biden had, how should these funds be coordinated and spent? Okay, and the way we're going to operationalize this is we're going to say, remember this K variable that measured how many ships a port can handle at a time? We're going to say, suppose that we give each port one at a time, the ability to handle one more ship, which corresponds to about a 1% change in overall capacity in the US. Okay? So I'll walk you through the economics, and then I'll show you the main answer to this. So let's take a port, let's say Hampton Roads, Virginia, which is actually one of the more valuable ports in our sample. And let's suppose we treat Hampton Roads, Virginia by increasing its infrastructure So what's going to happen in Hampton Roads? Hampton Roads is going to have more capacity, so immediately time at port is going to go down. Okay, time at port goes down, all of a sudden this port becomes more attractive. So demand for Hampton Roads is going to go up, both because new traders are going to decide to trade, but also because people are going to substitute away from substitute ports. Once demand goes up, congestion goes back up again. In urban transport, people refer to this as the iron law of congestion, and they say you shouldn't build a new road because people are going to take their car and it's useless to build the road. But this is international trade, so it's different. If more people are going to trade, congestion might not be the primary target, and actually it's good if we're generating new trade. So the final outcome should be a large increase in trade flows and a smaller decline in congestion. Okay. What happens to other ports, okay? When I invest in Hampton Roads, Virginia, this is not done in a vacuum. I'm affecting other ports. So here's what's going to happen. All the ports that are a substitute to Hampton Roads, Virginia, are going to see their demand go down because now Hampton Roads is more attractive because it has lower congestion, it has more capacity. So a bunch of ports are going to be negatively affected. They're going to lose demand, okay? But that's not all. This would be the standard thing if we were, studying, I don't know, cereal. But now what's going to happen is congestion is going to change at these ports. Okay, so people leave these ports, which means that there is now that their congestion is lower. Okay, these ports become decongested, and in fact, this pushes demand back up. It's not going to push it all the way back up, but it's gonna dampen the substitution effect. Okay. Okay, so here is our main numbers. This is, if you don't, this is for each port, if we change capacity one at a time, the change in welfare, okay? And if you don't like welfare, the same map, it would look exactly like this if I showed you total trade, okay? And so what you see here, the way I read this map, is that there are a lot of ports where it is not at all valuable to invest. But there are some ports, and if you target those ports, the returns are quite substantial, okay? Which are these ports, okay? It turns out returns are going to be highest. You have to look at two things. The port itself, And so it turns out you really want to invest in ports that were congested and that were geographically attractive, that were close to many diverse destinations and origins. And second, you have to look at the spillovers they generate. So you have to look at what are the substitute ports? Are these ports themselves congested and geographically attractive? And so both of these things are going to matter in terms of where you want to invest. Okay? The last question for investment, before I move to macro, you want to also think about net returns. So these are sort of the benefits. We need to compare them to costs. Okay? So we create a measure of cost by looking at the cost of land acquisition and estimating a dredging cost function. And then we ask, out of these 50 ports, for how many of them do these net benefits that we calculate surpass the costs? And the answer is there's about 15 out of 50 ports where the net returns are positive. And a lot of them are in the Gulf, East Coast, and Northwest. Okay? We also think about this world of increasing volatility. And we ask, how frequent do macroeconomic shocks have to be to warrant investment? All right, so this has two interpretations. It has the interpretation of we live in a more volatile world, or the policymaker cares about resilience, okay, much more than just the average. And so to operationalize this, we basically increase the volatility. Okay, so this is the baseline level of variance of shocks. You want to invest in 15 ports, as I said. But as you increase volatility, you want to increase in more and more ports, okay? But there will always be a mass of ports where you never want to invest, okay? Even if volatility is super high. So we think of 3 messages from this work. The first is that there is a lot of value to targeting investment. So there are substantial gains, but you have to think about where to actually go and invest. That spillovers across ports are actually large. And this suggests that decision-making should not be decentralized. We should not have a gazillion port authorities doing their own thing. And finally, returns change radically depending on macroeconomic volatility. Okay. Thierry?
The additions.
No. So this is still
it's individually.
This is still marginal. So this is still one by one. We are now running an exercise where we say, suppose you did a handful at a time.
Okay, because that's a more complicated.
It's more complicated, and what we see is that essentially if you say, okay, I'm going to invest in 3 ports at the same time, what happens is you will want to place them far away. So you will want to do 1 Gulf, 1 West, 1 East, for example. Okay, so for the last bit of my time, I want to talk about transportation and macro outcomes, okay? So I'm going to go back to this figure of time at port, and I'm gonna put it right next to a figure of commodity price inflation. Okay, and you can see that during COVID, both time at port and commodity prices surge, which has generated a lot of interest in terms of what is the impact of time at port and transportation on macro outcomes. Okay, and I'm sorry, this is an old set of slides, so I'm gonna skip this actually, and I'm gonna have you only look at this last bit because I don't have time to go through everything. But essentially, when we try to answer this question, there is a recent literature that has really tried to get at this by regressing essentially the left graph on the right. So we do a similar exercise, except this literature, basically for the economists in the room, does not instrument, and there is a huge endogeneity problem here. So we construct an instrument based on service time disruptions, and our answer is that for COVID, port congestion explains a substantive share of commodity price inflation in the order of 5 to 17% of price increases, okay? So the last bit is really trying to understand how this happens, okay? So there is an impact from transportation to prices, but how? And we need to understand how if we want to make policy prescriptions. So I'm going to give you in words a very simple model that we write down, okay? So let's say you have two countries that are trading in something, grain, I don't know, whatever, cars, okay? So take the most standard, simplest trade model that you have, or none at all. Just say these countries want to trade in some good. And what we're going to say is, listen, if you want to take 100 tons of grain from point A to B, you actually have to put it on a ship, and there is this transportation sector that has to carry this product, okay? And this transportation sector, we're going to think of as having a certain capacity, okay? So the transportation sector every period can handle a specific amount of cargo, okay? So the transportation sector for us is going to have ports and ships, okay? So the ports are going to be characterized by their service time and their capacity, and the ships are going to be described by the fleet S and the distances that need to be traveled, okay? And these four things together are going to determine the capacity of the system that I'm going to call Qmax, okay? And so what's going to happen here is, let's say I want to buy 100 tons. If the transportation system can carry 100 tons, great. Then we are in our straight introductory trade world, and I get my 100 tons. But if the transportation sector cannot handle 100 tons, then I'm stuck with whatever the transportation sector can handle, and there is a bottleneck. And this bottleneck can happen either because the fleet hits the constraint or because the port hits the constraint, okay? And when that happens, when the constraint is hit, then prices jump, okay? So just like we see in the data, prices are flat, and then they jump, and then they're flat, and then they jump, and then they're flat, and then they jump, because these constraints are binding at different times. Now, it's a very simple model where you're not seeing it, but believe me, it's quite simple, but it's very rich in capturing a lot of what we've seen. So for example, you can have service time disruptions, which can be things like COVID personnel restrictions or strikes or crane breakdowns. You can have disruptions in distance, which is the Suez blockage or the Houthi attacks where ships have to reroute. You can have disruptions in K. This is rare, but for example, the Baltimore Bridge was a disruption in K. You can have disruptions in S, which is Trump's proposal to impose fees on Chinese-built ships. And you can have very complex disruptions where you have at the same time a demand shock meeting one of the other shocks. So for example, COVID or Ukraine or the 2006 to 8 boom and bust are all much more complex situations, okay? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to show you a bunch of graphs, and then I'm going to stop, and I'm going to walk you through a lot of these examples to show you what actually happens to prices. Okay, so to give you a sense of what's going on, think of this as consumer prices or commodity prices. And here I'm doing the simplest counterfactual, which is an increase in demand. So this is an exogenous increase in income, like COVID was an increase in the demand for durables. And so demand goes up, prices go up, fine. So demand goes up, prices go up. At some point, the constraint binds. Could be the ships, it could be the ports. At some point, the constraint is going to bind, and prices are going to start going up more sharply. Okay, so let me show you why. Okay, let me show you why this happens. Let's start by looking at throughput. Okay, so this is throughput against the demand variable. I'm always going to denote by Qmax by the dotted line. So Qmax is flat, demand rises, throughput rises until it hits the constraint, and then you get stuck. You have a shortage of goods because you've hit the constraint. I'm sorry, I had to change the order of this. This translates to transport prices. So transport prices are flat, they're just marginal cost, and then you hit the constraint and they spike, and then this is the same graph as before. This passes through to consumer prices. Okay, so let's see what happens with a service time disruption, okay? So this is service time. So think of this as COVID personnel restrictions. This is throughput. Qmax goes down because as service time goes up, ports cannot handle ships. And ships, there's fewer available ships because they are stuck at port. So the capacity of the system goes down. In the beginning, we're not constrained. We have our output. At some point, we hit the constraint, and then we get a shortage. This translates to transport prices, which again are flat until they hit a constraint, and then they spike. And the same thing happens to consumer prices. Okay, my last two are the most interesting. So this is Houthi attacks. So Houthi attacks are a change in trip duration. Okay, so throughput, again, Qmax, the capacity of the system goes down. The reason is that now if ships have to reroute, you have fewer available ships, and so the capacity of the system goes down as trip duration goes up. Again, Q is flat, it hits the constraint, and then we get a shortage. This translates to shipping prices and to consumer prices. Okay, where are we in the data? Okay, so in the data we are at here, and when the Houthi attacks begin in 2023, we move here. Now notice we were already constrained when the attacks start, and so we see a small increase in distance, which leads to a small change in transport prices and a small change in overall prices. But this is bulk, okay? So in containers, we had a much bigger impact of Houthi, okay? And you would have seen a much higher increase here, and I think a much bigger impact in transport prices and overall prices. Okay, the last one is the current policy to tax Chinese-made ships that enter the US. So this is changing the number of ships that are available. Again, it's the reverse, but it's the same thing. So again, Qmax is going to go down, the capacity of the system, as you have fewer ships available. You're going to hit the constraint, and you're gonna be at capacity. This is going to translate into transportation prices and into consumer prices. We say roughly, you can think of this as a 50% reduction on the fleet, which means that we would be here. We are already constrained, and this would lead to a pretty substantive decline, to a pretty substantive increase from here to here in consumer prices. Okay. Last two graphs. Let me go back where I started, the COVID disruptions. What happened during the COVID disruptions? These are very complex. They're not just T or just D or just S. It's a demand shock along with a service time shock. And what I'm plotting here, the gray line is the capacity of the system. It changes because of service time and other things. And the blue line is and the blue line is the traded quantity. And what you see is that the system was unconstrained, but then around COVID, we get very, very close to the constraint. So we are starting to hit the bottleneck, okay? And so except for this one point here, which is the war in Ukraine, which is actually a supply shock. And so the system became lax again because these are bulk commodities. And so grain production went down. And so the system was unconstrained. Okay, so what does this mean for prices? Look at just the black and the green line. The black is the data for what happened to commodity prices. The green is a world where there are no bottlenecks. So as if there are no transportation constraints. You can see that between 19 and 2021, they're very close because the system is unconstrained. But in COVID, the constraints tell us what is the difference in prices. And so you can see that with the exception of Ukraine, in 2023 or so, there is a large impact that these bottlenecks are having on commodity prices. Okay, and that's more or less all I had. So, you know, after being invisible for a long time, transportation has been in the spotlight as a major disruptor. We measure the cost of these disruptions. We measure the returns to investment in port infrastructure, as well as the impact of transportation on macro outcomes. And I'll leave it at that.
we have time for a few questions. Yes.
Imagine that you're just interested in reducing shipping disruptions and you have a fixed infrastructural budget, as like you were talking about. But imagine that you could spend the money either on port infrastructure, which is what you're talking about, but also on road and rail. Would there be any possibility of allocating some of it to increase the substitutability between ports, for example?
That's a great question. Well, you mean substitutability between ports and roads?
From this port to that port, because we're both serving the same inland market,
Yeah,
that sort
I
of
see.
thing. Yeah.
Right. So I think that's a hard question. In the context where I know the data, which is the US, we look at international trade. So a lot of it, if you think about roads versus sea, for many international routes, it's impossible. So there is that aspect. Like if you care about the international component, especially for these commodities, but even for manufactured goods, air freight is not a huge share. So for a good chunk of trade, you will have to deal with ports. For domestic trade or between landlocked countries, I think it's an interesting and difficult question. For example, in Africa, I think roads are a huge deal. In the US and Europe, they're probably a smaller issue. But it's hard, and I don't think anyone has put together these two modes to think about this.
Okay. So I had a related question. Sorry, I had a related question. So in your substitution, do you account actually for the rail connection? Because a lot of this grain is going to be, transferred somewhere else in the U.S., even if it comes or oil or those bulk.
Yeah.
and so the substitution has to account for the next mode of transport, which is probably usually trains or
It's a good
trucks.
question. So two things. The first is that we control for commodity, which takes care of a lot of that. The second is that in the US, the majority happens actually through tracking for those goods. So it's in that sense, it's more flexible. The last thing is that there is not that much heterogeneity in the connectivity of these ports to a first degree. But I think it would be fascinating to put together the different parts, because especially in other parts of the world, I think it's first order to add the next part of the logistics.
And so just another. So this iron rule of or law of congestion. So this is the same. You get the same elasticity that you increase. It's 1-for-1. If you increase the infrastructure, you get same amount of traffic. So as far as I remember, on roads, it's like 1-for-1, right? You increase one lane, you're gonna increase the traffic the same, and you get the same congestion.
Yeah, no, you get a small reduction in congestion. You get a small reduction, but it's much smaller than the original substitution effect.
So Kevin and Thierry already asked two of the questions I had that I thought they were the most intelligent questions. Now, finding a third one exceeds my mental capacity, but I'll try to rephrase the questions and take a different angle. So the first one is related to the port capacity and the inland transportation capacity. So the welfare effects might, actually part of them might be reduced if the transport system is clotted in the inland because of the increase in the port capacity itself. And the second one is that I wonder how would you think about the comparison between subsidies and investment? Because if there are ports that are systematically underutilized, then the first best seems, at first sight at least, is to make those ports arrive at full capacity. And so you can do it by subsidizing the services, in which case some ships would go to those ports. That comes at a cost that would have to be compared with the cost of investment, of course, in a long-term perspective.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think you're right that in some sense you would want to do an exercise where you have a planner and you say, I have a, that's what's running now on some computer, actually. You say, I have this budget and I have 50 ports. Let me start with the first, let me see, which one is the highest returns? Okay, give them extra capacity. Now let's recalculate the welfare gains. What's the next one? Maybe it's the same one, give more. And then you keep doing this until you actually exhaust your budget. And so in principle, I think one of the, and I alluded to that, I think one of the important implications of doing this exercise is going to be whether, for example, you want to allocate investment at different parts of the world and you want to create one big board rather than three. So we know that, for example, the technology that we estimate gives increasing returns. There's actually increasing returns to having a bigger port, which in some sense relates to what you're saying, because do I want to have 3 small ports across which I can substitute, or do I want to have one big one? And it turns out that there are increasing returns that come just from the fact that the less space you have, the more likely you are to be constrained. So if you have 3 small ones, it's not the same as having one bigger one. The chances of getting constrained are actually lower. And so I think once you start thinking about the planner problem, these are the considerations that start popping up. And this is why we say that uncoordinated action from policymakers is not a great idea. And actually, interestingly, when different states compete for municipal funding, they actually bring this argument. So Georgia, for example, when trying to draw municipal bonds, would go and say, don't give this money to Florida. Florida has 16 port authorities while I have 1. And so I can actually coordinate how these funds are being spent.
Thank you so much for the analysis. I really like this targeted, where the investments are best targeted. And I was wondering if you have an example of policies under Biden or some examples of investments that you did monitor and found were more or not so effective itself. And also if you can talk a bit about Trump's perspective on investing in ports, just because I don't know the answer to that. That'd be useful.
Yeah, that's a great question. I can't say I can speak to recent investments. Actually, even Biden's bill was a small share compared to the private initiatives or the local initiatives, which speaks to this decentralization as not necessarily a great idea. So the Biden bill, which was discussed a lot, was I used to have the numbers, but it failed in comparison to the billions that were planned across different port authorities, private terminal operators in the U.S. So this speaks to the fragmentation. So current policies, it seems there is a lot of discussion right now about reshoring shipbuilding in the U.S. and building. Starting to build, I'm not going to say rebuild ships in the US, because there was never really a production of ships in the US other than World War I and World War II. So there are policies with respect to that, and there are policies about taxing ships that were built in China or companies that own Chinese ships. And I think our work speaks to the implications of these types of policies. I'm not sure I've seen, but I could be wrong, policies regarding investment in infrastructure, actually.
Thank you very much. I had a question regarding the type of bottlenecks you mentioned. You said that it is either the port capacity or the ship capacity that is binding. And I was wondering whether you can disentangle the two effects, notably by looking at price fluctuation for the port operations. Because my understanding is that the cost of shipping encompasses both shipping cost and port and terminal operations, but maybe having details, dynamic figures regarding the variation in port operation can bring something to the debate.
Yeah, that's a great question, and one limitation of this simple model, where all the rents, when there is a bottleneck in our model, which is very simple at this point, although we're augmenting it, the returns go to ships. So essentially, in the model that we have now, ports are not strategic actors, so there we don't have port prices spike. But you're exactly right. When we add that, we will have a fourth graph that says port charges, and so depending on the bottleneck that binds, the corresponding price will spike. But that's exactly right. What we see in our data, it seems to us that in the real world right now, the two constraints are both very close and very close to being binding, which in some ways it makes sense. It means we're not like crazily overinvested globally in ships and ports. That's a good point.
So related to this, since you were focusing on the need for investment in infrastructure and the impact it would have on prices, is there any congestion pricing strategies? I mean, does it exist? I mean, maybe you're not the one to ask. Maybe people in the room may know. But is there no room for a market-based solution to congestion?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Prices? That's my first question. The second relates to the fact that you study bulk. And so my comprehension of bulk is that it goes from one point to the destinations, like a taxi thing. When you enter the world of containers, you have this possibility of a port specializing in transshipment. And so it complexifies a lot the analysis of what is a valuable port, I guess. And so possibly the number of what you say valuable ports shrinks because you need to put all your focus on those transshipments. I don't know. So
great questions. Congestion pricing. I actually came determined to find out more about how ports price outside of the US. We actually have a very short paper we're preparing where we show that at least in the US, there is no congestion pricing. Okay, so prices are just flat. If you're, like, it is quite remarkable. This is bulk in the US. I know that in container shipping, I believe there are, especially in Europe, I think there are these types of practices. But in our paper, we actually know what the optimal pricing would be for ports, and we're curious to implement and see what it gives. Containers, so we focus on bulk consciously because we thought that for doing the disruptions and understanding how congestion works and all these more macro things, it was nice to be able to abstract from everything you just discussed. But right now we have a research team of another 4 that is cleaning the container data, but the model is going to be much more complex. But I think we know how to do it, which is actually, I think it's going to be great if we manage it, because there's very little work doing network formation, and I think we have a way to do it. So in 5 years, I can, or 10, I can.
We have one last question.
Thank you. Maybe the last one. On this one, just picking up on congestion pricing, I think I'm from CMA-CGM. Congestion as a price, that's for sure. On that, I was wondering whether there would be any kind of impact if we consider vertical integration between shipping and infrastructures, maybe not that relevant in bulk because it's very atomized market from a supply perspective in the shipping business for bulk. Maybe something that would be applicable for a container, which is less and less an atomized market on this one. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm extremely interested in that question. And actually, it was one of the first things we were interested in doing about container ships. Maybe you guys can help us, but the data on who are the terminal operators are very spotty. So we actually have a snapshot, but we don't have a time series of how that changes over time. But we would need this type of information to think about the efficiencies that are to be had from vertical integration. I think it's a very, very interesting question.